So think about where we're going to go. If it was that bad back then when there was enough game to hunt, everybody knew how to farm, everybody knew how to hunt, trap, fish, people knew how to repair their own, people knew how to sew their own clothing, make their own clothing, repair everything, and they still struggled. So what's it going to be like now when very few people know how to do much of anything? Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output. But very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that we study cosmology. People like Dr. Pierre-Marie Robitaille trying to figure out what the sun's really made out of. Because, the sun is the Rosetta star for the rest of the universe. What any star is doing, we base our invalid fusion core gaseous plasma model of the sun to try to guess things like that star's mass and all that stuff. And that stuff is all cartoonish non-science that came out in the 1860s. The sun appears to be made of condensed matter, otherwise its spectra wouldn't be the way it is. And a fusion core doesn't explain anything like sunspots or granules or the cycles or coronal holes or any of that kind of stuff. And I'm a firm believer that once we get the physics correct on this, it's going to open up a whole new world of more technology. So that could be the kind of thing that prevents a thing like a solar minimum from having as big of an impact. There's been a lot of scientific innovation since 1929. So put it this way, I don't think the Earth's population is maxed out at 8 billion. I just think that resources aren't allocated correctly. And I think there are too many people that have no clue what's going on, because they're trapped in the daily slog of their lives. They don't have enough food, or they got a dirt floor and no electricity because they live in a fourth world country. But at the same time, people that live in first world countries are stretched to well beyond where they should be. I was telling people to buy silver when it was $14 an ounce. And, plenty of people were still allowing their payroll deductions to buy a bunch of Google and Apple stock. Another important thing to do, too, is to do stuff like force on force training without getting too much into guns. I got my girlfriend an airsoft pistol for Christmas so we can shoot at each other, because it's nice to know what the lines are like around your home. It's like, hey, why did you buy your girlfriend a gun? So she can shoot me. Perfectly good reason. I mean, she has a real one, too, but you never know what it's like trying to reload when somebody's shooting at you until you're trying to reload while somebody's shooting at you, if you know what I mean.
And, these kind of basic skills that everybody's going to need in the future, basic firearms training is going to absolutely be needed, either for hunting in itself or for defense. And don't delude yourselves to believe that we're going to go quietly, kumbaya, into the night if we get enough money for indoor vertical agriculture. It just doesn't work like that. In my own opinion, personally, you can agree or disagree. I just think that we're not going to have enough food to feed the planet, and there's going to be a real push and pull to see who gets allocated those grain resources.
Russia's the largest exporter in the world of wheat. And
that's exactly the same I'm talking about, too. They're not going to be sending those exports out any longer.
Yeah, we probably read the same article.
You got to get this. They were trying to say, the news article, at least the way that was explained to me, was the farmers and the citizens of the country were in such an uproar that Russia was going to export the wheat that it was going to drive up internal costs, that started pressuring or rioting or protesting or whatever, so the Russian government backed down. Now, you and I both know that's a fallacy, because just like they would be, the Chinese government backed down, Russian government backed. No, they didn't. They just are using that as a convenient ploy to give an excuse not to export. And I don't blame them one iota. because they understand what's coming.
I think what happened was they ended up making what amounts to a new cabinet department to, I don't know, have a panel or whatever, but to actually kind of like the way the U.S. created the Department of Homeland Security in 2001.
Department of the Grand Solar Minimum.
Yeah, the Grand Solar, the Cosmology Department of the U.S. That would be good.
And understanding that these seismic and volcanic events are cyclical, and you'll want to check out Upheaval, Why Catastrophic Earthquakes Will Soon Strike the United States. Leading experts in the geophysical effects of climate change make a strong case for a link between the sun's cycles of behavior with highly destructive earthquakes. The authors explain that when the sun goes into reduced energy phase, a grand solar minimum as we're entering right now, it produces colder weather and the worst earthquakes across the historical timelines. Included are easy-to-understand charts and graphs showing that we face an imminent threat. Find out the status of the threat for California, Alaska, South Carolina, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and many other states and regions across our planet. And if you want to support this broadcast, click the link in the description box below to Upheaval, Why Catastrophic Earthquakes Will Soon Strike the United States, available in both paperback and Kindle versions. I wish we'd actually start these debates, but nobody is willing to. Hero Castillo Cortez going off on the Green Deal, and I did 2 videos talking about the volcanic eruptions during these grand solar minimums would reduce solar panel output anyway, just through history when we see the amount of volcanism associated with the grand solar minimum. So knowing in advance to build solar panels when there's going to be more volcanic dust in the air makes absolutely zero sense to me.
The worst part, man, is that all the hysteria is based on the false premise that CO2 has anything to do with temperature on this planet, other than the fact that CO2 goes up after the temperature does, because more life grows, especially in the oceans, via photosynthesis. It's shocking. You try to debate somebody on this kind of a subject, and you don't even know where to start. Where do we start? Oh, okay, we got to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, why? Because the planet's getting hot, but it's not. The ice sheets are going to melt. Well, ice sheets are sea ice. If you have a glass with ice cubes in it, does the water level rise when the ice cubes melt? It's just you on and on and on with articles every day. Like every article that has anything to do with planet Earth has to slip in some kind of thing. Polar bears are invading Russian towns because of global warming. No, they're invading Russian towns because it's too frozen in the Arctic for them to get through the ice to seals.
Yeah, they had to kill quite a few last year in Newfoundland as well, up in Labrador area of Canada, because the same thing, the polar bears were coming into the towns. Yeah. And it seems that there's a plethora of polar bears. We've been told that polar bear populations are declining due to global warming, but the newest census put it, this is the Canadian Ice Service, they put it around 25,000 polar bears, but back in 1970s, there were only 5,000 polar bears. So literally the polar bear population is 5 times greater than it was in the 1970s. And it seems that, whatever happened with the sea ice is the exact same thing in Russian town as was in Canada and Newfoundland last year, where they had to put down a bunch of these bears due to them coming in. You can't even go out of your house. Polar bears are outside.
Yeah.
Calling off school because the polar bears are outside. Imagine we have a polar bear day. No snow day. We got a polar bear day.
Cold kills polar bears. Warm doesn't kill polar bears. Warm doesn't kill people. Cold kills people. The whole debate is so ridiculous. The Minoan warm period was 2.5 degrees warmer than it is now, and that's Celsius. And by the way, if you're worried about Antarctica thawing, Antarctica formed 34 million years ago when it was 3 degrees C warmer than it is now. You have to come out with an encyclopedia of refutations to even refute anybody. It's practically on the realm of the flat Earth debates at this point. It's so ridiculous.
If I could throw a little caveat in here. Quiz time for those of you out in listening land. Extinction level event on the planet Earth. What are the parts per million when it goes below that? What is the total ppm for carbon dioxide? When below that threshold, it's an extinction level event for all planet life and the flora fauna on this planet. At what ppm level do we need to be an extinction level event where there's not enough of it that life ceases on the planet?
You're saying when there's not enough carbon dioxide?
Correct. What's the ppm measurement when we go into an extinction level event because there's not enough CO2 to drive everything else that's going on in terms of the life web?
I have no idea, but I'll bet you got an answer.
280.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, we're at 410, and I'm like, as more northward we can go away from that ELE kind of number at 280, please get me higher. I want to go higher. I want to go further away, but nobody ever talks about that. We are literally like 100 and some ppm away from an extinction level event. The highest levels they've recorded are 7,000 ppm on the planet here.
We're building CO2 sequestration machines to try to scrub the CO2 out of the air. It's insanity.
And how much really are they going to pull out in the entire scheme of things? And they never really talk about the major polluters. They always talk about what the westernized first world nations could do. Yeah. What about all the developing nations that are still burning unfiltered coal? Just everything is going up the stack. There's nothing on. There's no scrubbers on anything. It's just burn, 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 and just make an economy. Well, no, they don't tell any of them to pull back their usage or construction or energy. No. What is this with this? Only half the world needs to abide by it. The other half can still add CO2. It doesn't make sense.
It's pretty crazy. You know, the two most populous countries in the world are producing the most CO2, aren't they? India and China.
They have a special hall pass to be able to put more CO2 up because they're still developing. But it's such a global emergency. We need to tax you and make you walk to work uphill both ways for 5 miles. But they can still
it's pretty crazy.
Burn.
I was at the Bernie Sanders School of Economics the other day, which is an outhouse, and I was really hoping that they would gut that building and insulate it because it was kind of cold in there. There's a lot of dust, too, and no books.
Yeah, and you had to go with your lantern, huh? Oh, don't burn the lantern. You got to put CO2 up there with your kerosene.
No, I used a solar panel charged LED bar for it. Now, that's what Bernie told me to use, so.
And as we get through with this insanity of the politicians trying to push their own dog and pony tricks through to get more votes for the younger generation who's been indoctrinated literally for their entire lifetime into this whole debate of a CO2, oh, we have all these solutions. It can only be solar, it can only be wind. What I wanted to talk to you about here for a second is Castillo Cortez never mentioned once gravitational vortex power. She never talked about trying to dust off the patents from Marconi, from Tesla, from Rife, and from Dr. Brown for electrogravitics, to try to work with any of that on the Earth's magnetic grid to power devices. Forget burning anything. Why don't we just use the Earth's magnetic field to push magnets to make electricity? No, they don't want to talk about that. It only can be wind and solar. Makes no sense. There's all these other options they're not even considering or they won't talk about.
Exactly. I mean, I first heard about zero-point energy in probably like the year 2000 or so. And it was just a show on the Learning Channel. I didn't necessarily believe it. The guy sounded like a kook. But, I mean, the deeper you get into the physics of this stuff, the more you study things like David LaPointe's work on plasma and stuff like that, it's like there's got to be a way to make a generator that has zero friction out of this stuff. You know, I think there's some possibility that even if we went into a proper glaciation, the human race could largely survive. Although if you get an event like the Doug Vogt catastrophe cycle, that'll be a little, that would be bad. Let's just say the Doug Vogt scenario would be bad.
Are you talking about a mini nova from the sun where he's talking about the granules pounding onto the moon and different things that they found up there?
Yeah. And, you know, the possibility that the Earth stops its rotation and then within one day reverses its rotation and so on as an explanation for the geologic layers at the KT boundary and stuff like that. There's a lot of scenarios, but even with a scenario like that, if human resources were allocated better than they are, there'd be a much better chance to save, 30% of the entire species or something like that. Again, hot doesn't kill people. Cold kills people. If it gets too hot, you take your shirt off. If it gets too cold, you freeze into a block of ice. Being hot doesn't necessarily, of course, everybody uses air conditioning in hot areas. I understand that hot temperatures cause the electrical grid to have increased strain on them. But ultimately, what it comes down to is if the planet gets like a degree colder, spring isn't going to arrive in the northern U.S. until June. And that's going to be a problem for things especially like agriculture. I think if everybody just was a little bit better, and this is why I'm trying to improve my growing skills because I'm terrible at it. My skills have increased in leaps and bounds over the past few months. Just growing these indoor tomatoes, I've learned so much just through trial and error, essentially. And I'm also trying to get some mold resistant strains too, because mold is a huge problem for a ton of people. And the more stagnant things get, the more moldy things get. And I actually have a couple plants here that I've cured of mold. I trimmed leaves off of them. I know this is super controversial, but I trimmed leaves off of them and they didn't die. They continued to grow. So I kind of just kept them away from the rest of the plants. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to have some mold resistant seed strains here.
Yeah, and the airflow and everything as well. But I want to bring it back to the reversing Earth for a second here. That's not possible in science and what it is possible, but it's just conjecture so far. But if you look back into the ancient accounts from China to the Bible and everything in between, they talk about the Earth standing still and then re-rotating. Yeah. So it's at least happened once during at least the written records of our own last 12,000 years, at least once it's happened because it's in these cultures across the planet. The Earth stood still, and then it started to re-rotate, and the sun rose in the wrong direction. It rose from the west. So then it had to have reversed itself because now it rises from the east. So whatever happened back then, it had to have at least had one more turnaround to bring it back to the original east-west direction.
Right. And I would think it's very important also to note the fact that this catastrophe may happen at the end of the glaciation, not at the beginning of the glaciation. The glaciation might happen rather suddenly too, but you can't say for sure. And of course, obviously we can't see all of the cycles. And we can't necessarily predict how they all overlap each other. We've only been counting sunspots for, I guess, counting the Chinese ones, 1,000 years or so?
They would use a piece of paper with a pinhole in it, and then it would drop a shadow on another surface. Right. They wouldn't look directly at it, but they would have a pinhole. And again, were able to see cosmic rays coming out of this, apparently. I don't know exactly how you do that with the visible spectrum, but they would show what looked like filaments and different rays coming out or entering into the sun with that. And then it would come along with the legend of the three-footed crow. And you wonder, was that a massive coronal hole? But again, you can't see coronal holes with your eyes unless something really changes in the sun that we're not expecting. Where these accounts in the ancient Chinese relating it to, mythical birds across the sun and giant portions of the sun that are black, because they specifically talked it being a black crow with 3 feet. Now, would that have been filament plasma streamers coming off with some kind of central body? Would it be an inbound field or a Birkeland current coming in that created the beak or whatever? But all these ancient stories are related mythically to the sun, that they saw something visibly, at least enough to categorize it. Well, it looked like a black crow. Maybe they didn't explain it was a coronal hole, or imagine if a sunspot the size of a quarter of the sun comes across. That would be completely so far out of bounds of what would be expected. But how would you explain it to somebody and then pass that down as our own knowledge, and then somebody 4,000 years in the future would read our writings and go, what were they talking about?
Yeah, I hear you. If I saw a sunspot that big, I don't know how I'd explain it. I'd have to figure out a way, though, because I'd be putting out a video in the morning about it. So I'd figure something out. Try to have some clue about what the magnetic fields are doing, if they're shrinking or growing. Geez. You got to wonder, is the nova event associated with a turned on sun or a turned off sun? Does the solar nova event, if you believe in it in the first place, does it come out of a coronal hole when the sun flares out? Like what happens if a coronal hole stretches all the way from the north solar pole to the south solar pole? Or does it come out of a sunspot? Is it a result of high activity or low activity? You can't possibly know unless you've time traveled or something, right?
I'm looking back in more ancient history. I'm looking at the activity state of the sun declines. There's got to be some equilibrium happening. So if it's an overcharged capacitor, if you will, a cosmic capacitor as just a simple example, if that electrical charge needs to go somewhere, if it's overcharged. Now, what you find routinely, if you look back, what are the numbers that keep recurring again and again all through all cultures? And we go back thousands of years. It's the same numbers repeating again and again. 36. So I was talking with Rolf Witche, and he was saying, yeah, if we get down in the 30s, there's a very possibility that this is going to happen. We don't even have to go anywhere close to zero. But why do the ancients keep pointing to 36? Perhaps it is when there's a 31 in there, solar wind and the field current comes down to 36%, something flips at that point, and that's what sends everything into motion. Because I don't know why these same numbers are so ingrained across all cultures on the planet. It has to be something with a percentage-wise, or I mean, you can go into the numerology and magic and everything, but that's completely different. I'm just talking about marking in time for things that will never, ever, ever be forgotten because they put it in religion and belief. These numbers are everywhere. Why are they here all the time? 36.
Even the Wu-Tang Clan was into 36.
I remember the Wu-Tang Clan.
Yeah, 36 chambers, man. Most historic hip-hop albums of all time.
That was way back in the day when the scene was first getting started.
Oh, yeah, that was 1991.
Run DMC was back at that same era, yeah. That was some solid music back then.
Right on.
TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. There's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. Microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds. How the media is going to try to downplay this and deflect it and try to silence some of the information coming out as we move forward because they're going to want to control the narrative to try to prevent the panic. The panic's going to come anyway eventually. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's like being on the Titanic. You watch that movie, and it's a perfect example of what's about to happen for our own society. When it first hits, the whole bunch of high-level people understand what's going on, the captain, the crew, etc. Then they go to the elite, the people with money, the first-class passengers, and they explain to them what's going on, and they all do their own maneuvers to get ready. Now, the rest of the people are left until the very last to understand what's going on. And once they understand it, they panic. So when we come into this, how would the global media, corporate-controlled mainstream media, how would they push the message to control that it's still CO2? Because everybody's going to be angry once they realize they've been lied to. And they could have had more time to prepare even from 2-3 years ago, 5 years ago.
Exactly.
And control the narrative so no outside information slipping into, put oil on top of the water here, if you will.
Well, that's a good point. And, I think that's part of the reason why your channel has such value, because you're not in the U.S. You cover a lot of world news that I don't see unless I specifically look for it at places like BBC or, Yahoo News India or whatever. So I think you get some insight into that we're not going to see here. Now, of course, it's not like I'm sitting here watching CNN ever or anything like that. That's a big deal. I think that's a huge benefit because you have insight, and plus I have a little bit of insight too that's not going to be covered in the news. And while I don't do my channel based on a professional capacity for my quote job end quote, which is primarily for the purpose of food safety, but also for nutritional integrity and redundancy testing and a little bit of chemical synthesis our company does. But I get a little bit of insight because we're in the food supply chain. So when things start to change, if we start to see clients dry up, I won't be told directly that it's happened, but it does happen. Now, sometimes the client they'll just try at a different laboratory. The laboratory that I work at, and I do field management, so I'm rarely at the laboratory, but our laboratory is the northeast portion of the entire North American continent. So I do have a little bit of insight that I can throw in there, just not in a official professional capacity.
Well, keep going. I'm very interested in what you just said. So I'm sure everybody else is. Can you enlighten us a little further? Add a little couple more nuggets on top of there.
Well, I've been with this company. I'll be with this company for 3 years in August. And my job is primarily go to the laboratory, figure out what the schedule is, and then I drive about 200 to 400 miles a day, just going to something like 2 to 5 clients, and I got to go visit their facility. And I have some insight into what their output is. I can't tell you who any of the clients are because there's confidentiality agreements. For instance, I can tell you that Burger King's not our client. However, if you were aware that Burger King was doing lab testing on their food and you had no idea what you were talking about, you might be concerned that their food's going to be tainted, as opposed to, realizing that it's probably going to be less likely to be tainted as a result of being tested. So we operate in stealth. And that's why I don't give out very much information about what I do, because it needs to go on in the background of the supply chain. Nobody wants to think about salmonella or whatever. Well, our company is one of the major companies that is preventing that from happening. Now, if I saw any major things going on, I'd mention them. That wouldn't violate any confidentiality or anything like that. But at the same time, I know that there are some global crop losses, and they're serious. It's not normal for Paris to get a hailstorm where they get 12 inches deep hail. That's not normal weather. Just for the record, a cold atmosphere conducts electricity more easily than a hot atmosphere because it's denser. Just throw in that little piece of physics in there because it's really important.
It's beyond important because you realize that those lines can ground out through the air if it truly gets that cold, because the insulation in Alaska, for example, they plan for that. But we're getting down where we saw these super freezes in Missouri and places like Chicago, a little bit further south, these all-time coldest temperatures ever. What if the next few years are even colder? Those lines are not planned for that. So it's very possible that current could find its way out through the cold and ground out through that medium that you're talking about. This is an elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about at all.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people out there, and Thunderbolts Project just did a video about this. Just at the same time I was arguing with somebody in my comments section about it, that you don't need that liquid metallic core of the sun. You don't need that. You just need condensed matter with electric current passing through it. So it's kind of important. If you've got greater atmospheric conductivity, then the current's going to have an easier path. At the same time, the magnetosphere is shrinking. The ionosphere is getting closer to the planet. I've got tons of videos on my channel from over the summer where I have satellite images of Lichtenberg patterns over northern Pennsylvania and New York, and all kinds of Hall currents, and this is one of the reasons I have such a beef with the chemtrails thing, because people are looking at stuff happening in the atmosphere, persistent contrails. I'll be the first guy to say that's probably from cosmic rays, not from chemicals being sprayed out of a plane. I think there's all these fundamental misunderstandings going on, and it's helping to have people looking at the wrong variables instead of the right ones to understand what's going on above their heads. I see it all the time. I'll see a bunch of naturally occurring cloud patterns that are in a perfect parallel pattern. Sometimes it'll even look like the ground symbol on an electrical schematic. When I look at the satellite data, I can see right where the Hall currents are. By the way, for viewers who aren't aware, a Hall current is the perpendicular current that comes out of an electrical field, or a magnetic field, rather. So if you take a magnet and pass it through another magnet, you get electrical field lines that come out perpendicular to the motion of that. And that's largely what causes the Earth's jet streams. So all this stuff figures in together. And, people like Svensmark, who figured out that cosmic rays cause an increase in cloud nucleation, that's a big deal. So yeah, man, there's a lot that goes into it. And that's why we're poring over the data every day, trying to figure out if there's any correlation between something like the electron flux. I mean, we just had an article last week where a guy showed that the electron flux is associated with generating ozone around the equator. So there's so much stuff going on with it. And hey, maybe we'll discover something we didn't know yet. That's the whole point. We're kind of pouring through the data every day, try to see if we have a little bit of perspective that nobody else has, or something like that, to perhaps make some sort of scientific difference. It's a rabbit hole that I went down when I was about 4 years old, was the first time I ever heard of cosmic rays. And then, fast forward to astronomy in college, where I started to learn about dark matter. And that turned me off to the entire field of astronomy for about 10 years. And I finally got back into it when I started studying the sun as a result of becoming a cyclist, because I realized that I can't predict the weather just by looking at stuff like temperature and barometric pressure and humidity. I need to look at more stuff than that. And so I ended up studying the sun even more, and here I am.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.